Hi everyone, welcome to this event from the School of Media at London College of Communication, which is part of University of the Arts London. I'm Rebecca Bramall, I'm a reader in cultural politics at the college, and I'm the moderator for this evening. Today we're celebrating the publication of a new book by my colleague Dr. Sara Marino, and her book is titled Mediating the Refugee Crisis, Digital Solidarity, Humanitarian Technologies and Border Regimes, and it was published by Paul Grave Macmillan this autumn. This evening, Sara's going to introduce her book, and then she's going to discuss some of its key themes with our three guest speakers, Myria Georgiou, Amanda Alencar, and Koen Leurs. And the last half hour will be given over to your questions. So whenever you think of a question you want to raise, please do type it into the Q&A box, and the speakers will address those questions later. So I'm going to briefly introduce today's speakers. Sara Marino, as I've said, is Senior Lecturer in Communications and Media at London College of Communication, and her research focuses on the relationship between digital technologies and transnational spaces, migrant identities and communities. Myria Georgiou is Professor of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and her research focuses on urban technologies and the politics of connection and the ways in which migration and diaspora are constituted in the context of mediation. She's currently working on a book with Lily Chuliraki titled The Digital Border, which examines technologies of power in the context of Europe's migration crisis. Amanda Alencar is an Associate Professor in the Department of Media and Communication of Erasmus University Rotterdam. She specialises in media and migration and intercultural communication. Her research and her work focuses on how communication technologies are shaping mobility and socio-cultural integration processes of refugees in diverse contexts. And finally, Koen Leurs is Assistant Professor in Gender and Post-Colonial Studies at the Graduate Gender Programme in the Department of Media and Culture Studies at Utrecht University. And Koen is the chair of the European Communication Research and Education section on diaspora, migration and the media. And Koen is currently fellow at the Netherlands Institute of Advanced Studies, working on a monograph titled Digital Migration. So we welcome them all. And first of all, we're going to go over to Sara, who's going to introduce us to the themes of her new book.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to London College of Communication for hosting this event and for looking after the logistics of it. And thank you to my colleagues Myria, Koen and Amanda for taking the time to read my book and for writing such supportive and encouraging reviews. I'm beyond grateful for that, so thank you. So I would like to start my presentation by introducing a couple of quotes from, I don't know if you can see, I hope you do, a couple of quotes from one of the Syrian refugees I've interviewed for my book. And I really hope that you can see that. I've lost my screen, so I'm not sure you can. Okay, perfect. So yes, we would like to start my presentation by introducing a couple of quotes from one of the Syrian refugees I've interviewed for my book. And the quote reads, "My mobile is my homeland, my identity." And it was one of the first things that Ahmad told me when I interviewed him for a journal article initially. And as a migrant myself, I've immediately understood the affective, the emotional, and the material nature of this statement. But as a privileged migrant, I couldn't fully grasp what he said afterwards. The technology somehow was a lifeline for the majority of them, and that people were ready to give up their cars and everything, but not their mobile phones. So I was determined to know more, and I began writing this book in 2017, when the number of people forcibly displaced as a result of the Syrian civil war continued to represent one of the most pressing political issues in the public discourse in and beyond Europe. Labeled as a crisis, as a problem, and as an emergency that was never seen before, demanding mainly military interventions, able to control, to monitor, and to stop the movement of unwanted people, the so-called refugee crisis also immediately presented itself as a heavily techno-mediated event. From news pictures of refugees charging their phones in refugee camps or taking selfies to document their safe arrival in Europe, the relationship between human mobility, forced migration, and digital connectivity became object of heated debates in academia and outside academia. And this has included, of course, the debate on the evolution of Europe's migration regime, which many have argued has also witnessed a massive intervention of technologies for the purposes of migration management and for border control. From drones monitoring seas and lands to artificial intelligence-driven systems of registration and authentication, from biometrics to digitized forms of surveillance. And in a much more simplified way, we can summarize the complexity of this debate by using three very popular buzzwords: digital border, the connected or digital refugee, and digital humanitarian, which are also the protagonists of my book. And to me, the convergence of these three trajectories was really something that deserved more research, and a research that would recognize technologies as an entry point rather than a product, a research that had to be interdisciplinary and had to combine history, philosophy, migration studies, and media studies in order to fully grasp the complexity of the debate. And also research that would consider the voices of those people who are often marginalized or plainly ignored. So the book wanted to do that by bringing in the experience and sentiments of migrants and humanitarians, which I thank again for the time that they gave me. So I would like to start from the digital humanitarian, because I think that this part represents the most original contribution of my book. And I start again with a quote: where humans can go, data can go. And this was said to me by the founder of an application for financial transactions in the refugee communities. And I think that reflects extremely well the degree of optimism with which technologies have been embraced by the humanitarian sector and by private actors and by volunteers. So as we know, the humanitarian world has witnessed a massive shift in the way operations are conducted and in the way that aid is delivered. And also in the way private actors such as tech corporations, Google and Microsoft, for example, have embraced the more humanitarian spirit by investing money for connectivity projects. And I do talk about that in my book, but I was also more interested in the contribution of different actors, the actors that I call as argue are part of the tech for social good community. Private entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, digital humanitarians, techies, software developers, volunteers, and the civic tech community in more general, who decided to do something to help refugees. And since 2015, we witnessed an explosion of hackathons, digital events, mobile applications for refugees. We had more than 1,000 applications for refugees. And the digital projects more generally, they were meant to help forced migrants by providing material and effective support, skills, tools, and a way to become more empowered because connected. So the idea was that behind this explosion of tech for social good initiatives, the idea was that refugees with a smartphone or refugees with digital skills were also refugees that were not only connected but also self-reliant. So I was fascinated by this techno hype that surrounded these technologies in the civic sector. But I was also curious to understand the real impact of all of this. And I thought that the only way to do that was to interview those who were part of the tech for social good communities, but also refugees, to understand whether they thought, what they thought about these technologies, whether they were really useful and whether they were using them. So three big questions really informed my research and really the interest behind this project, behind this book. So how does the tech for social good community perceives the contribution of technologies? What is the relationship between the humanitarian sector, the tech industry, and governments? And finally, which is the most charged question, I think, can tech for good activism challenge the techno-militarized infrastructure of Fortress Europe from below? So between 2017 and 2019, I've interviewed several organizations such as Crisis Classroom, Code Your Future, RefugAid, TechFugees, and Empower Hack, among many others, in an attempt to shed light on the different ways in which solidarity can be activated outside the more mainstream and the more established networks of humanitarian organizations. And I can't go into the details, of course, during this presentation, but the book presents a list of opportunities and advantages that technology and solidarity bring in this particular context. And you can see some quotes here. And I examined a lot of opportunities from the ability to crowdsource creativity, to collaborate beyond and across borders, the idea that tech is future-facing, is scalable, and it is by nature innovative. So it is an enabler to achieve something. So I was very impressed by the enthusiasm and the awareness that my respondents from the Tech for Social Good community had in relation to the contribution that tech could make in refugee context, and the idea that tech was part of a broader picture and a broader ecosystem that could help to achieve longer goals. And the idea that technologies might not be the solution, but just one among many. So that was incredibly positive and incredibly empowering. But the more I was talking to the Tech for Social Good communities and refugees, of course, the more I realized that several challenges hindered the long-term opportunities that tech could bring in terms of circulating solidarity. And I examined some of them in the book, including the problem of running solutions or designing projects in Europe without having people on the ground, which all my respondents realized it was a problem and addressed that already, but also the difficulty of building trust, which was very important, the problem of inclusivity and how tech could bring the human element to the center, also by involving refugees in the design, planning, and delivery of digital solutions. And of course, also the more logistical issues with tech, including the duplication of efforts and the problem of sustainability. And also, more importantly, the application of the business model of the tech industry and the IT industry to a sensitive context like the refugee crisis. For example, the idea of impact or the idea of disrupting something which is a concept particularly problematic when it comes to a context of crisis or context that demand a particular caution and attention. And of course, the risk involved in collecting and storing data. So in fairness, the people I've interviewed were all aware of such problems, but some issues remained. And so I try to open up in the book these questions about what I call reactive creative activism. So I theorize the tech for social good community as an example of reactive activism, because their idea and their enthusiasm was driven by the desire to do something to address the inefficiency of European institutions. And it was a very reactive activism because of the opportunities offered by technologies. But also the question remained, how can we reconcile the politics of solidarity and the ethics of data collection? So I devised this framework that I called mindful filtering as a way to invite and encourage the tech for social good community, as well as humanitarians more generally, and politicians about the use of data and whether or not this is really necessary. So the notion of mindful filtering is quite a gamble and a risk in some ways, because it's quite a problematic concept to break down in this particular context. But with mindful filtering, I wanted to bring in two important conditions: the element of mindfulness and the element of filtering. So as mindfulness predicts the necessity of being in the here and now and to have an holistic understanding of what is going on around us, I thought that as a framework, it reflects incredibly well the need for organizations and actors, public and private, to understand and to have a more holistic understanding of what data collection and data filtering imply, and whether or not is data collection always necessary. But also the awareness that the other is a human being, of course, so which is often ignored when it comes to the application of data. And in fact, during my interviews with the tech for social good communities, the idea of refugees as customers was incredibly problematic, and was also identified by refugees themselves as a very problematic element of tech for social good. So the identification of refugees as customers, which is something that I think the notion of mindfulness might help to districate and to break down. The valorization of identities that cannot be reduced to binary logic. The idea that the other is not just a piece of data, but it's of course much more complex than that. And of course, the mindfulness invites people to invest on creating spaces of self-reflection. And I think that is also an important element to consider when it comes to technologies in general, especially when it comes to technologies applied to contexts like this one. And the idea that, again, the question that collecting data is not always in the best interest of the other person, and the recognition that the refusal to give consent should not hinder the possibility of movement, which is a very important problem when it comes to technology use, especially in context of surveillance, when refusing to give consent denies access to certain services, also in the humanitarian sector. So the notion of mindful filtering, I think, allows us to reconcile what it means to circulate solidarity across and beyond borders by taking into account the intrinsic challenges and tensions of data collection. So the question was, can tech for good solidarity, can the tech for social good community create a space where the more political infrastructures of Fortress Europe can be torn down? And in order to understand that, I needed, and I think we had to consider bottom-up practices of digital mediations, as well as top-down practices of mediation. And I do that in the first half of the book, where I talk about the digital border. And as I compare the more political acts of digital surveillance with refugees' practices of digital connectivity. And borders are quite sensitive areas of debate. They are everywhere, they are often invisible, but they are also very visible, and they're also incredibly material. So, which is why in my book I approach the notion of border from many different angles. First of all, from an historical point of view. Why were borders created in the first place? And also a philosophical point of view, and philosophy, and especially philosophy of power, really helped to break down the complexity of borders as institutions of sovereign power, as mechanism of identity formation, both in terms of negation of identity and valorization of identity, which I hope I'll be able to explain more during the Q&A. And also from a more media point of view, looking at borders as performative spaces, as a socio-political constructions, and as performative spaces. And of course, I also, in that part, which is the first part of my book, I also examine some of the most recent interventions and technological interventions that the European Commission has actively supported in an attempt again to give a more holistic understanding of the bordering practices in the past as well as today. And as you can see here, more recently in 2018, the European Commission has decided to increase the security fund to improve its migration policy and more generally to create a safer, as they say, and more resilient Europe, a Europe that protects. And that includes the large amount of funding mobilized to address the refugee crisis and the humanitarian crisis, as they call it, both inside and outside Europe. And this represents an incredibly gray area, especially for the bodies of refugees and marginalized communities who are transformed into pieces of data that machine can more easily read, authenticate, stop and monitor. And the transformation of refugees into testing grounds for technological experimentations to process and to sort out refugees. So as I examine, as I provide these historical, philosophical, and media excursus of the evolution of borders up until today, I also ask whether or not there is a way out of the digital border, and whether or not we can think about a more positive and more productive understanding of Fortress Europe by using, again, technologies as an entry point, or technomediation as an entry point. So I do ask, can technologies offer refugees a platform where power can be contested, where Fortress Europe can be contested, and where dialogue can be imagined? And can connectivity offer a pathway for more inclusive forms of digital citizenship, for the acquisition of visibility and voice? And the connected refugee, or the digital refugee, has been at the center of several studies that also the other guest speakers have been involved with. They often approach them, however, from an outsider perspective and trying to understand what the digital means to them. And I think that's incredibly important, but it's also important to, of course, ask them how they use technologies, what they think about technologies, what they think the opportunities and challenges are. And this is what I did in my book by interviewing Syrian refugees living in London. And the result of my interviews is the identification of connectivity as a central to mobility, as the initial quote really well explains. And crucial for preparing the journey, for navigation purposes, for connecting and so on. And the complexity of these technology uses demanded, again, a closer understanding of the different ways in which technologies are used, which is why in my book I distinguish between technologies in exile and technologies of exile. And by thinking about technologies in exile, I look at how, through the interviews, how technologies are used pre-departure to organize the journey, during the journey to Europe, and upon arrival. And the result is an incredibly rich and variegated debate and discussion on the crucial role that technologies have, but also and interestingly, my research discovered more complex uses of technologies as forms of mediated witnessing, which is why I also talk about technologies of exile. As this quote says, documenting the journey would not be possible without technology. So that was, I think, what allowed me to reflect more critically on whether or not technologies can become a platform for refugees to acquire a sense of agency and acquire a voice. And the result, I think, it's incredibly problematic. Also because, of course, my respondents didn't have the same understanding or view of technologies. But from the research I've done, it looks like this is extremely problematic, because a number of opportunities are offered, as we know, in terms of connectivity, in terms of ownership, and in terms of agency. Having a smartphone and being connected really allows forced migrants to finalize and to make decisions. But limitations occur in the shift from private uses of technologies during the journey, for example, to the public space, when it comes to finding out if this agency and this voice is also recognized in the more mainstream spaces where citizenship is negotiated, then the problems arise. There is an accountability deficiency that precludes dialogue and an accountability problem on the side of institutions. There is no clear policy framework where these the initiatives by the Tech for Social Good community and the practices of digital connectivity are recognized. And problematically, what precludes dialogue and what precludes perhaps citizenship is the difficulty of going beyond the good citizen ideal. So finding and cultivating spaces of representation and spaces of visibility where refugees or forced migrants don't have to conform to the ideal of the good citizen, or the ideal of the connected refugee, or the ideal of the vulnerable individual. So to be able to break down these pre-packed forms of representation is particularly problematic when it comes to really looking at the transformative potential of technologies in this context. So acquiring a voice outside these spaces of representation is incredibly difficult and has a long way to go. So I won't spoil, of course, the conclusion that I come to by integrating the digital border, the digital refugee, and digital humanitarian. But what I will conclude by saying, perhaps stating the obvious, is that the combination of bottom-up forms of resistance and solidarity, either in the forms of tech for social good opportunities or digital connectivity, everyday practices of connectivity, can potentially tear down the walls of Fortress Europe. But the challenges are quite important, and there are processes, still processes of physical and symbolic bordering, which Myria also talks about, that prevent refugees in the first place, but also volunteers from creating a stronger response, a counter response to the digital border. But I want to keep a kind of a positive outlook at the same time. So it is in its darkest moments that humanity always finds the courage to create more welcoming pathways and circuits of solidarity for groups, for communities, and for individuals. So I hope that the book gives some space to this hope. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will also post in the chat a link to a voucher code for the book. That's my email address and Twitter if you want to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sara. A wonderful talk. And we're going to move now to the part of the event where we hear from our guest speakers. And Sara has prepared 3 talking points which we're going to address, and so Sara's going to briefly introduce that theme, a particular strand of her research, and then our guest speakers will respond briefly, drawing on their own work. So Sara, would you like to speak about the first question?
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. So the first question has to do with the first part of my book. And we know that many states and organizations are involved in migration management, have experimented with technologies to reinforce borders, from biometrics, as I said, to artificial intelligence systems. To this scenario, I tried to propose an alternative and slightly more optimistic perspective that also sees technologies as instruments of resistance, and where more inclusive forms of representation can be managed. So my question is, as a media migration scholar yourselves, how do you contextualize the impact of digital connectivity in the context of Fortress Europe?
So we're going to go to Myria Georgiou for the first response.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Sara. Thank you to the organizers for including me in this event. And thank you, Sara, for this challenging question that I will try to address. And allow me to address this first question in some length, taking a few minutes to answer your question. Because I think that question about the relationship between migration and digitization is reminding us that we need to understand any answer in its complexity. And I will try to do that with a reference to what I have learned or what I'm trying to learn through my own research by making 3 key points. So the first point that I want to make is that there's no doubt, and I think you make very eloquently as well in your book this point, that we need to understand now the project of Fortress Europe and the project of the border as a techno-discursive assemblage of power more generally through digital connectivity. And if I could simplify what this means, it would be the need to identify the role of digitization in displacing the visibility of the border's violence. And in practice, this means a number of things. So in the context of Europe's outer border, for example, I think it's very important to understand how this violence is expressed first in the very ordinary management, the everyday ordinary management of deserving or undeserving travelers via the use of biometrics, personal data, and AI. But also now how we see this violence expressed in the extraordinary but intensifying militarized operations that use tracking technologies to push back migrants before they can even voice their claims to European territories and rights. And perhaps more worryingly, we need to be aware of the border's invisible to citizens violence, which is located inside Europe's territories. And this is a violence that is reproduced through technologies of perpetual surveillance of migrant lives, as these take place on their social media, but also in work environment and even in education. And in these ways, I think it is important, even if we want to keep hope, and I will come to that in a minute, I think it is important to understand how digital connectivity does not only become fundamental to the governance of the border, but also to the displacement of its visibility. The displacement of a visibility that hides its material and symbolic violence, especially away from public systems of knowledge and from public debates. The second point I want to make in response to that big question provocatively contradicts the first one, where I claimed that we need to understand the border through digital connectivity. In fact, I think this is what I will be talking about in a minute is precisely a contradiction that those of us who are interested in the relationship between digitization and migration need to constantly keep in mind. So, and we need to do that and reflect upon a contradiction, because otherwise we end up enjoying that comfort of techno-determinism that puts digitization in the center of all our understanding around migration. So my second point is one against technology. Any analysis of digitization and migration, I think, and I always need to emphasize that, needs to be grounded in the histories and politics of migration and its governance. Let us remind ourselves, of course, that historically the border has not been generated through technologies of connectivity, but in fact through long-standing and diverse technologies of nationalism, Eurocentrism, and colonialism. So like Sara so eloquently does in her book, I try to always remember that research on migration is more than research in technology. And I think there's often a seduction in focusing on technology, that we forget that actually research on migration and technology carries enormous responsibility for understanding the deep inequalities revealed and often hidden also behind the border as a regime of racialized and biopolitical power. And the third and last quick point that I want to make in response to that question is that we, of course, need to remember that even though the border is becoming a powerful system of racialized biopolitical power, we should not forget forces of resistance to the border. So digitization is not per se a system of control, as we know. And in fact, those of us who go out in the field, we're forced to move away from the neat narratives of the techno-determinism, especially when we can observe migrants, very diverse uses of technology, or when we can observe the everyday or organized solidarities, not least as we see them in cities that become refuge, or in transnational networks of migration that become systems of mutual support. Thus, to that complex story of digitization and migration, let's not forget hope and resistance, as I think, Sara, also you remind us in your book.
Thank you, Myria. We're going to go to Amanda now.
Thank you. Thank you, Sara. Thank you, Myria, for your wonderful interventions. I would like to pick up, Myria, on your point on contradictions. Also, when we talk about paradoxes, right? In my brief intervention, I would like to highlight the paradoxes of increased digital surveillance in the face of limited or almost absence of knowledge about the multiplicity of refugees' experiences and lives, on border spaces. So the more, the more surveillance, technologies of surveillance are being developed, it seems like the less we know about what's going on, about the diversity of experiences and the struggles and the needs of people on border spaces. So I say that, of course, digital technologies in the context of Fortress Europe, it's a very complex issue, as Myria addressed, and indeed it has become a powerful and effective tool for both control and agency. So I think it's very important to highlight those paradoxes, because it seems like increased digital surveillance is there, but at the same time, we know less and less about the struggles of these people And I think that's a very important point. Another point that I would like to highlight in relation to those complexities and contradictions of digital technologies in a context of Fortress Europe is that the higher technologized, right, borders have become, it's like the more insecure the journey for refugees have also, become as well, right? So it seems like the more technologies are there, more deaths in the Mediterranean. And I think that's also a very important point and in terms of reflecting on the power of technologies being used by government actors in Fortress Europe. And in this grim scenario, I would say there is room for contestation. So we know that migrants are developing migrants and refugees strategies to protect their identities, and also to sort of somehow make do with this situation. So I will continue this conversation in the second question. I will leave the floor for Koen now.
Yes, let's go over to Koen now.
Thanks so much. Thanks for involving me here. And congratulations also, of course, on the release of your important book. I would like to pick up on two things. One that Amanda mentioned, the increasing invisibility of technologies of control, and on Myria's point on the historicizing what we're seeing in the contemporary moment. And particularly also maybe historicizing our understanding of technologies, and what we're seeing is actually part of a long durée of structural violence enacted through technologies. So if you, and please bear with me, I've prepared a couple of minutes response. So I hope this comes across still at this moment of day. So as you've detailed at length in your book, recent attempts of governments, humanitarian agencies, private parties in Europe and beyond, in order to solve the so-called refugee crisis, have very much demonstrated an experimental technology-based, have turned to technology-based solutions, or are showing techno-solutionism, or technophilia even. And our arsenal weaponized includes surveillance drones, sensing robots, AI intelligence, lie detectors, fingerprint biometric databases, servers provision based on iris scans, DNA testing, blockchain technology experiments, social media monitoring, and predictive analytics. And as Amanda mentioned, it seems that we know less and less about these technologicalized mechanisms. And I think particularly now we're seeing and hearing less about these experiments under the COVID-19 pandemic, as journalistic accounts are dwindling, and this is slowly slipping from our radar. But actually, I firmly believe that technological acceleration is very much happening. So in a sense, the refugee regime has become, as you mentioned, also a testing ground of technological experimentation. And you've importantly, in articulating technologies as a testing ground, you've also highlighted the roles of resistance and contestation. And I think it's interesting to think both together, so the technological experimentation as well as the contestation from a historical angle. So how can we understand this, what you describe as the nervous system of techno power from a historical point of view? Because these technologies of control, they haven't emerged from from an ahistorical void. So maybe seen from a longer durée, the techno-mediation of European colonialism and, for example, Nazi totalitarianism have shown how plantations and later camps have been also turned into testing grounds, for example, for purposes of identification, measurement of bodies, administering bodies, datafying bodies, ranking and surveillance. For example, the birth of securitization through biometrics or the methodology to recognize humans on the basis of physical or behavioral traits dates back to the racial science of colonialism. And during the Holocaust, the Nazis tested so-called Hollerith punch cards to contain racial hygiene. In 1943, that Third Reich consumed 1.5 million special printed cards, which facilitate identification, transportation, and eventually extermination. So the violence that we are seeing as part of the technological experiments, which are increasingly under the radar, are perhaps not an interruption or an exception, but maybe they're reflective very much of a longitudinal status quo of exploitation and thus of violence of subordinated groups. Then in parallel, even though many media theorists have argued that in the cybernetic circuit of technologies, there's potential for contestation materially embedded in the technology, for example, Wendy Chun and others, there's actually very little attention for these histories, the actual empirical documented histories of resistance. For example, resistance in the colonial era in plantations, in Nazi camps, but also in contemporary refugee camps. These are very much under-researched. They deserve much more attention, and your book has shown the urgency of actually doing that, taking into account subordinated people's resistance to technologies. And that was the end to the question.
Thank you very much, all of you. Sara, would you introduce your second question now?
Yes, which I think connects extremely well with what you said, and I appreciate the complexity of the tensions and the complexity of the dimension at stake when it comes to addressing also the historical evolution of these debates, and I recognize the importance of keeping also non-digital media-centric perspective and to contextualize both resistance as well as activism and other uses of technologies. So speaking of technology, my second question is, in the kind of towards the end of my book, I talk about technologies for solidarity and how these acts of digital solidarity across and beyond borders take on different shapes and different forms, and together really complicate the humanitarian landscape. So my question for you is the following: do you think that these acts of resistance, as you mentioned, this act of counter resistance, can create a space where alternative frameworks to Fortress Europe can be imagined? And do you think that these acts of mediated solidarity can create also a space for more inclusive dialogues and more inclusive sense of responsibility towards the other and towards refugees in this particular context can take place?
So we'll go to Amanda first.
Yes. Sara, I think definitely mediated solidarity is an important instance of contestation and resistance, in particular considering violent and oppressive border practices and also exclusionary asylum systems and policies in Fortress Europe. For this question, I would like to highlight 2 points which I think are relevant when reflecting on the potential of digital solidarity in refugee settings. First, we are aware, you've discussed in your book extensively, that technology solutions, they can enhance discrepancy and reinforce power imbalances, and in this case, in the context of Fortress Europe, but also in other contexts of forced displacement. You said also, well, the proliferation of hackathons, apps, and platforms that were developed in 2015 beyond to face the refugee crisis, and mostly developed by activists, aid organizations, private actors to assist, right, refugees through digital access. So despite the best intentions, policy documents, academic articles, including your book as well, you've mentioned that over 1,000 of platforms and apps did not take into consideration the realities and the lives of refugees and migrants, and issues of surveillance, literacies, and also visibility, because many people didn't even know that certain apps and platforms existed, but also lack of trust in those tools, accessing unknown websites and having to give in their data is an issue, right? So In a nutshell, although these issues became visible in the context of EU refugee reception and settlement, it seems like in many instances, lessons have not been learned. And if in fact, I think these issues continue and they have been perpetuated and transferred to other contexts of forced migration. Taking the example of changing a little bit the context here, but the Venezuela migration crisis and Brazil in the northwestern region, which is a border region in the country, we've seen now recently in the context of COVID crisis, collaborations among different stakeholders, humanitarian actors, NGOs, and so forth, coming up with all kinds of digital solutions that remain disconnected from the realities of migrants on the ground. To give you an example, recently there was this WhatsApp group that was created by a local NGO and in partnership with UNHCR in a region, and this WhatsApp group was supposed to serve as a channel for information for Venezuelans amid COVID situation. However, Venezuelans reported that they could not even write messages, only the administrators. And you know, this resulted in many leaving the group, and they also had to choose how they would spend the credits they have, right? Either on, well, websites or other apps that they would feel more, you know, they would get more information or more, or having their voices heard somehow, or in this app, right? So I think against this background, just to go back to the point, it is important to bring attention to also important initiatives that have been developed with and by refugees and asylum seekers through and in a digital, such as the creation of support and help groups in WhatsApp to facilitate translation of government measures during the COVID pandemic, but also to provide mental health support or other forms of other kinds of relevant information for accessing rights and public services. So, and in all of those became essential to fill in the gaps of states' asylum and integration systems during the pandemic, as we've seen. And so it's very important to insist on the first point on the principles of sustainability, collaboration, and ethics, right, when it comes to developing those digital interventions. Otherwise, these practices will continue to perpetuate. And a second point, very briefly, it's about our roles as researchers in contributing also to creating these spaces of digital solidarity. So for instance, through our engagement in activist networks and initiatives to expose power asymmetries and exclusionary policies and practices among government actors and agencies like Frontex. Also, we should continue engaging in collaborative efforts to develop ways to make our scholarship, our research public, so that we can give back to the communities and populations we study. Thank you.
So, Koen, would you like to add anything there?
Sure. I'd like to echo a few points indeed that Amanda also mentioned. So what I know about solidarity in the humanitarian landscape, I should emphasize, I've learned from reading studies like yours, Sara. But I also like to put another point, which I've learned from doing fieldwork with young refugees, particularly here in the context of Netherlands, which is to maybe rethink solidarity not only as happening between non-migrant groups and migrant groups, but also as a very much also internal dynamic among migrant communities. And which is also what Amanda hinted at, indeed, at the importance and urgency also of informal networks, which migrants maintain, particularly in light of the contemporary pandemic. For example, after the 2015 crisis, we saw journalistic accounts, but also research on informal WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups, which were in a few accounts dubbed as the so-called TripAdvisor for refugees, and scholars use terms like do-it-yourself migrants, kind of celebrating and perhaps also fetishizing this kind of resilient state of resilience of refugees, adopting advanced technologies to make do of these hard and difficult circumstances. But to a certain extent, these networks beyond kind of the hype remain super important. That's also what I'm hearing in conversations with young people now, is that in situations now when access to, for example, government support, schooling systems, formal institutions is increasingly difficult or at distance and increasingly limited, young people of refugee background that I'm in touch with increasingly turn back towards to peer-to-peer, to migrant networks, to connect back with family members, exactly to kind of fill in the gaps of information precarity, fill in the gaps of fractures in the availability of information, as also rumors and so-called fake news circulate heavily, particularly now in these pandemic times. Thanks.
Thank you, Koen. Myria.
Thank you. I think many important points have been made already, and I'll try to add to these brilliant illustrations, because of course Amanda and Koen also come with their reflections, I think, from that experience of the field, like Sara does. So I would like to make some more abstract observations, if you allow me. Like Sara, I was very intrigued and very interested in all these projects that have exploded after 2015 around digital solidarity and support for migrants to develop their digital skills. So I think, of course, this is a very mixed bag, and I think the others have touched upon it already. But I think it's a mixed bag that is very troubling, and in many ways invite us to think and understand the complexities of thinking again through technology as data, as a project that in its own right carries certain values and certain potentials. So I would like to first say that these forms of digital solidarity, especially those forms of digital solidarity that support digital skills for migrants and refugees, represent new forms of solidarity that compensate to a large extent for the failings of the state. The failings of the state and the deliberate withdrawal of most of the European states from the protection of fundamental rights and welfare more generally. And I think the role of the state is something that perhaps we want to touch upon it a bit more later on in the discussion as well. So these digital solidarities that we're discussing here are solidarities of crisis. And as such, they're solidarities of despair, but also of hope. A bottom-up response to the needs of migrants for employment, but also a response to their demand and their right for recognition of their agency and their multiple capabilities. But of course, I think on a second level, we need to not forget the ideological drive behind many expressions of digital solidarity. Because, of course, solidarity, and even more so digital solidarity, are not neutral concepts, as we know. So very often these projects are driven, I think, and as Sara mentioned as well, by the desire to do good, but also to do good, as this is a value that is increasingly understood within the neoliberal hegemonic value system, a value system that puts responsibility on individuals. That puts responsibility upon individuals, the individual who helps, and the individual who is helped only when herself or himself demonstrates that extreme talent, that extreme resilience and determination to make a success out of a very difficult situation. So the project of digital solidarity very often is a project where we see the exemplification of an entrepreneurial individualism. And this can, of course, benefit some, and as I have seen also in my own research, those who benefit from this ethos are, of course, usually young people, well-educated people, usually men, but of course it's an ethos that leaves many behind. And the third element of this discussion, I think, is that many of these projects are driven by a techno-utopianism. And what this means is that digital skills are assumed to be in themselves a force of positive change for individual migrants' lives. But it also means that digital skills are seen as a pathway for gaining access to rights via the market, and especially a digital pathway in order to become a good migrant. And this is something that Sara mentioned already, as migrants are called upon to become individuals who overcome marginality through, again, those personal and unique traits of resilience, talent, and ability to succeed in the digital economy.
Thank you. Sara, I think you have one more question, and we'll take just some very short responses on that final question. And then I just want to remind our audience that we have a Q&A box that you can add your own questions to. So for the final part of the event, we'll move to your questions. But back to your final question, Sara.
Thank you. Yes, very briefly, because this discussion has been already very in-depth and very rich. So I'm really grateful to be here, to be able to discuss with you. And I agree, again, the tension between techno-utopianism and the need to do something, and how these different languages communicate, and how the language of the civic tech community communicate with the political language, and the other communities as well, which I try to extrapolate in my book. And you also mentioned an important dimension, which I briefly touched upon during my presentation, and I talk more in my book, which is the notion of ethic, and the notion of ethical technology, which seems a contradiction in terms, especially when we debate all the tensions and problems that you mentioned already. So thinking about that, we have a final comment, a brief comment on this contradiction, and on the need, if you think that there is a need to talk more about ethical tech, and where do we need to go in order to be able to break down the notion of ethical technology. And
shall I take up? Sure. Yeah, I think this question actually allows us to turn our gaze also inwards, not only to think about the ethics of technology as a kind of autonomous force which happens in the world out there, which us researchers can observe and scrutinize, but I think we ourselves are very much implicated in these technologies. So our ethics as researchers, as being part of the larger migration industry, I think here are crucial to scrutinize. And here we can perhaps think of one of the instances is the trend, of course, of big data and datafication, a twin force which is kind of trusted as a solution to challenges, as a kind of trusted way to offer objective, neutral decision-making opportunities, should actually be scrutinized and also raised should be questioned for exactly how they reproduce certain categories of mobile subjects, categories of desirable migrants, desirable expatriates, versus undesirable refugees who can be abandoned. So here, like other scholars before us, I think, and as also Amanda just highlighted, we should further also in our work politicize migration processes, also to understand exactly under which conditions the migrant is produced, and how we ourselves in our scholarship are also reproducing these figures. And here I think we can also take cues from a recent report by the UN Special Rapporteur, Tendai Aicumi, on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, which exactly highlighted the digital border as a kind of exemplary example of where things are going horribly wrong in terms of datafication and big data. So I turn inwards in terms of ethics of technologies.
I think I'm invited to comment next. Just very briefly, I think this is a very important point that Koen has made, and of course, I think the other element of responsibility is that we shouldn't only be aware of the kind of research we produce, but I think the challenge with technology is how, as we have repeatedly mentioned, all of us, I think, how the digital border is often hidden. So the challenge here is to make it more visible, and I think the repressive power of the digital border becoming more visible is something that we should act upon as academics, but also in not only through our work, but also in our participation in networks that bring together, I think, migrants, activists, but also academic communities.
I think it's me now, right? Also, very briefly, when we think about like ethics and technologies, and also I'm going to deviate a little bit from what Koen and Myria addressed. For me, it inevitably leads to questions of data literacy, and which also connects to media literacy, digital literacy, and that's the responsibility of. It's an education mission, right? So that's the responsibility also of tech actors, organizations who are developing technologies aiming for refugees and migrants, and or in those contexts of crisis, to be able to improve communication efforts about data-driven technologies. And I think there is room for debate, there is room for conversation, but there is a long way to go. And yeah, transparency and more efforts needs to also come from those who are developing these technologies. We know that it's very easy to say this, and communication needs to be improved. People need to know why they're using certain technologies, what is required from them. It's super. What I'm saying now, very utopic, but I think that these conversations we need to insist on that. So yeah, for me, it's a challenge also of data literacy, and the data literacy not only from like people who need to learn about how these technologies are being used towards them, but also those who are producing, they need to improve their communication efforts to be able to provide more transparency about the technologies they are providing.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and all of you. I'm sure that during the course of the final questions from the audience, Sara, you're going to have an opportunity to respond to this fantastic debate. But let's turn now to some of those questions, because we've got quite a few here to look at. The first question is from our colleague, Barfin Emre-Setin, and she thanks you all for your very stimulating contributions to the discussion. And Sara, she's asking if you could really develop your point about the relationships between borders and bordering and identity formation. She says that you mention processes of negation and valorization, but could you say a bit more about this process of the construction of identity?
Yes, thank you for the question, Barfin. So yes, so in the first half of the book, I talk about the evolution of borders, and I examine borders from a very theoretical point of view, including looking at borders as mechanism of identity formation. And what I'm arguing is that if we look at bordering practices, and if we look at how technologies are used to exercise a surveillance, we can see a number of tensions, a number of contradictions between the negation of identity and the augmentation of identity, I think. So on the one hand, we have the political negation of the identity, voice, and agency of these people. But on the other hand, we have an augmentation, I think, of their bodies. So when their bodies are transformed into biometric data that machine can read, can process, can sort out, we can see a sort of hyper-visibility of these bodies. At the same time, also a reduction of these bodies into pieces of information. So I think it's really interesting to see the tensions that are playing out in the field of bordering, and also in the way representation works when it comes to refugee representations, as the other speakers have very eloquently talked about, and also kind of moving away from the binary oppositions between identity and alterity, and between looking at refugees as either victims of threats or good people or entrepreneurial subjects or criminals. So I think that the notion of identity is incredibly important to discuss in relation to borders, technologies, and also in relation to activism, because it does highlight a number of tensions and contradictions that I think are incredibly important to break down. So negation and visibility at the same time. How do we make sense of these tensions? It's one of the questions that the book asks.
Thank you, Sara and Barfin, for asking the question. The next question is really about how we as an academic community can respond to some of these developments, so that some of the guest speakers might like to come in on this. And the question mentions the EU's new pact on migration and asylum, renationalisation, policies, the employment of new technologies which have been mentioned during the discussion, and concerns about the increasing securitization of the borders. So all of this we've really covered in the discussion, but the question is really asking how should we respond as an academic community?
It's such an important question, which we briefly touched in terms of responsibility that we as researchers and academics have when we debate and when we ask questions, when we interview communities and individuals, and I think that it comes really to what was mentioned before in terms of accountability, in terms of transparency, and in terms of moral responsibility as well, which I think is one of the problems that I highlighted since the very beginning of my book. We talked about technologies, we talked about surveillance, we talked about digital borders and digital humanitarians, but we need to really tackle these questions from the perspective of the people that are involved. And they are struggling daily with these questions and these tensions and the pushback and the security systems and the borders. And these voices are not often accounted as much as they should, which is why I wanted to give them the voice, give them the opportunity to tell us whether or not and how this connectivity plays out, and how their experience and how they want their experience to be narrated. And the chapter of my book is about these, and I talk about a fragmented methodology when I think about interrogating these questions, because it's an incredibly sensitive question, and we as researchers and academics find ourselves in a very tricky position, and the idea also balancing out our positionality as researchers working and living in the West, and working and living in Europe, and these communities. So incredibly, yes, these are fragmented methodology, fragmented communication. But I'm sure that Myria has.
Yeah, I think Myria would like to briefly respond as well.
Thank you. Yes, 2 points. One, holding authority accountable, which perhaps also Sara implied as well. We're in a position of authority. We have a symbolic power that many of the people who we're engaging with don't. So we have that responsibility not only to do research, but also to speak to systems of public knowledge. Second, we have to go out there and do research and get back to our fieldwork, and hopefully the pandemic will allow us to do that again. Not only do fieldwork when migrants come to us in our cities and our safe spaces, but we need to go out there in the outer border of Europe, because right now, precisely because of what has been noted in that question, there are tens of thousands of people who are being pushed back, and their experience is being completely silenced and unreported. And of course, because of these regulations, in combination to the pandemic, a lot of these realities are being hidden, and we have a huge responsibility, I think, to bring visibility to those new experiences of the border.
Thank you, Myria. I just wanted to say that that question was from Ilke Sanlier Yüksel, who's at Çukurova University in Turkey. Okay, we're going to go to another question now. And this is really a question about the role of institutions. And the questioner asks about really expanding on the concerns you've raised about the gathering of data, Sara, both from the migrant point of view and an institutional point of view as well. And the questioner is wondering whether institutions like the UN should have a greater role in providing some sort of technological framework that could be more easily trusted by migrants. So it's really about the role of institutions in this data collection processes.
Yes, thank you for the question. The notion of trust is incredibly important in this discussion, and it's something that I've raised with my respondents, both with the Tech for Social Good communities as well as with the migrants I've interviewed. And it plays a similar pattern. It's a question of important concern as well. When I interviewed migrants, they raised trust as a problematic aspect. Also, when it comes to more established organizations and institutions like the UN, which is something that I also witnessed with other volunteers who actually went to refugee camps in Greece to support, to provide help. And they told me that migrants were incredibly, did not really want to engage with more mainstream or more institutional organizations. They didn't trust them. So they had an important, they didn't trust more official organizations or big organizations like the UN, for example, and they prefer to trust more local communities or local volunteers to be able to receive updated information, for example, even to be able to have a closer channel of communication with them. And when it came to also trust with reference to the technologies of solidarity, one of the contradictions that emerged was, I think, the gap between the intentions of the institutions and the intention of the tech community and what migrants thought about that. And as Amanda mentioned before, I think it was Amanda, the idea that migrants don't use many of the applications or they don't even know many of the initiatives that are developed for them. And some of them, they told me, well, we use Google, we use Facebook, we use WhatsApp and Viber, but that was it. So clearly there is a mismatch between intentions and short-term and long-term impact. And trust is an important part of this tension and this contradiction. And it is trust about people, but it is also obviously trust about technologies, and it is trust about the use of data. And that comes with literacy, as Amanda mentioned, and comes with the lack of accountability and the lack of accountability on the part of institutions, as Myria also mentioned.
So Koen would like to make a small comment about that as well.
Yeah, exactly. Picking up on where you left, I think the question of accountability, I think that's one of the major points which really should be much more central to our discussion, because indeed the production of this state of exception has actually outruled many of the institutional mechanisms in place. So law in books is completely different from now law in practice. So what we see on the ground are breaches of many international treaties, UN treaties, but also, for example, recent EU guidelines, such as the privacy guidelines, GDPR. These are somehow suspended in this exceptional moment, and the rights of suspended subjects, like migrant subjects, are dismissed under this heading. And I think in terms of seeking an institutional answer, here the answer also lies with governmentality, by indeed holding our political systems accountable, because it's a political decision that people are dying at the border now every day. And there are institutions which try indeed to put this on the agenda and try to make this visible of what's happening. But it's, I think, politicians who are not listening here.
Thank you, Koen. Sara, we're going to go to the next question now, which is really about the relationship between different forms of solidarity emerging in Europe at the moment. And I think this is from Steve Crossett, the Dean of our School of Media. So it's really about whether you considered the relationship between forms of digital solidarity that are emerging and new forms of solidarity that have underpinned the rise of populist nationalism, so very different kinds of solidarity in a way, and the way in which populist nationalism has, of course, captured political agendas across Europe. So it's a question about forms of solidarity, I think.
For the purpose of this book in particular, no. For the purposes of this book, I mainly focus on what is happening right now, and I try to contextualize what is happening right now in terms of solidarity with reference to kind of a more theoretical and historical overview of borders, for example, but I haven't made that link for the purpose of this book. I was also, again, as I said, incredibly fascinated by digital solidarity, and digital solidarity was actually, even if it's the last chapter of the book, it was really the first element that that kind of guided me and shaped the nature of this book. So I didn't make that connection, but I think it is an important connection to be made. As Koen mentioned, I think it is important to always keep in mind a more historical overview, or a more kind of a long-term perspective, a more comprehensive and holistic overview of this debate at stake, because that's the only way we can really fully grasp the complexity of these tensions, these challenges, and also way forwards as well. So I didn't do that for this book in particular, but it's definitely something that we should probably consider doing as researchers.
Thank you, Sara. We're going to take, I think, this will probably be the last question, Sara, and it's really asking you to say, I think it's a really important question, to hear a bit more about refugees' perspectives on these issues, and their views about these supposed technologies of solidarity. So I'll ask you to respond, and then perhaps all of our guest speakers might just like to make one final little contribution, either in response to that question about refugees' perspectives and how they can be brought into the research, or about any other issue that has been left outstanding. So over to you, Sara.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yes, I mean, the very first thing that I can say is the mismatch that I immediately recognize the moment I kind of piece together the responses I got from the Tech for Good community, and which is, again, as I said, it's a puzzle of different actors, individuals, and different types of organization, which I use the Tech for Social Good as an umbrella term, but of course is a very variegated scenario. So the moment I pieced together what they were saying about the opportunities offered by technologies to circulate solidarity, and what migrants told me about that, the immediate reaction was the clear gap between these two forces. And although again, I interviewed different organizations and with different purposes and with different practices, and all of the organizations I've interviewed have been extremely successful in terms of creating forms of solidarity and creating also very transparent channels of communication with migrants as well. But more generally, when I ask migrants, okay, do you use all these technologies? What do you use and why? Immediately the gap was evident. They didn't even know what was being planned or imagined or devised or created for them. They were very very clear in saying to me, okay, we use this and that, we use Google, we use WhatsApp, we use Viber, we use Facebook, we use employment websites, and that's pretty much what we need, and that's pretty much what we use. But we don't need, or we don't use, or we don't even know what else is going on. So clearly, there is a lack of. There are a lot of opportunities, and it's a very promising environment. But I think that there is something missing here in terms of how these two communities can operate. The fact that in many of these, some of the platforms that I looked at and researched for my book, migrants were treated as customers, and in other occasions there was a lack of involvement and a lack of inclusion of migrants, refugees as participants. And that, I think, was one of the reasons why it's extremely difficult and extremely problematic to see how these solutions can work in the long term. Yes, it was extremely fascinating, I think, to see the gap straight away as soon as I pieced together the two forces, the two trajectories.
Thank you, Sara. So we'll have a brief comment now from our guest speakers, starting with Amanda.
Yes, I totally agree with Sara's point about this disconnection, despite, of course, a lot of efforts that have been made over the last 2 years, I would say. But still, the networks that are formed within the communities are playing a crucial role, because through these networks, access to different digital resources, but also the migrants come to know about other initiatives going on, and they trust each other, right? So it's in the most optimistic cases, right? So I think the networks is still a very important resource for becoming knowledgeable about what's going on in terms of digital solutions. But there is this gap. And another thing that I think it's very important is also the temporality of experiences in a particular context. So, for instance, based on my own study, I could see that the kinds of technologies, the kinds of digital resources that the refugees I interviewed over the years, they used in the beginning, and now what kinds of resources online they are actually utilizing completely differ. So there is this progression also across time, and yes, I do insist that that there is sort of this parallel reality between the solutions that are being proposed in certain contexts, solutions that in many cases do not really match with the realities of these people. But then there is also the temporal aspect of refugees' digital practices that can change and also evolve along with their experiences.
Thank you, Amanda. Koen.
I think following up from what Sara, but also what Amanda just said, I think what the pandemic has actually shown that there's a lot to learn, also from mainstream society, I guess, from taking refugee perspectives. For example, on the use of technologies, seeing that in many instances, refugee communities have been forced also to become early adopters of technologies. For example, to do digital intimacy across distance, so to keep in touch with loved ones and family members when being forcibly displaced. To a certain extent, that's what we non-migrant situations have been experiencing since the early lockdown periods and with COVID, and trying to make do while living at distance and living life at distance while remaining connected to loved ones across geographies. And there were some some accounts by journalists who exactly tried to highlight this story. And I think this is one of the important kind of ways to counter also our imaginaries of refugees and of migrant relationships to technologies.
Thank you, Koen. We'll go finally to Myria.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, many important points again being covered. I would like to just say that we do have a mixed bag here, and we have opportunities for young people, especially, as Koen just mentioned, to benefit from those capabilities they have to put some of those skills and the high levels of media literacy that they were forced to develop in practice. My experience and my knowledge from my own research of those initiatives of digital solidarity focuses on projects that promote digital skills for employment in particular. And I think this is a very important niche space that we need to understand. So we have, on the one hand, we have the people, the young migrants, who are emerging as hopeful and capable subjects who do indeed get opportunities that they might have not had otherwise without those networks of solidarity. But we do also have those invisible actors that are not part of that digital story that I have seen on the council estates of London or Berlin or the underbelly of the city in Athens. So the people who are not meeting that demographic of being digitally literate are the ones who are painfully aware, and they're increasingly painfully aware, I think, that this overinvestment on digital skills, on those efforts to promote digitality as a way to integration and inclusion, excludes them even more. So we have that dark side, I think, of digital solidarity, where we see migrants being again divided, and being divided this time between the good digital migrant and the bad migrant who cannot but be left behind because they can never fit the digital imaginary of the integrated good migrant.
Thank you, Myria. Sara, you'd like to follow up on that, I think.
Yes, just to wrap up on this crucial question, I think it is also important to contextualize the kind of interventions that we analyze and we discuss, because it very much depends on the people behind and the human element again. And so many of the organizations, the smaller organizations I interviewed for my book, Crisis Classroom, Code Your Future, Chain, and many others, they're doing an incredible job by talking to migrants, by talking to people, by asking them what they need. And so by creating this very honest and open and transparent channel communication about the skills, about the needs, about what is needed. So it comes from, again, a duality. It comes from a conversation. I think that really makes a difference when it comes to digital solidarity, and when it comes to the usefulness of these opportunities and the opportunities offered by platforms in this case. So contextualization is fundamental. I think it's a fundamental first step in order to be able, for us researchers as well, to make sense of these complexities. So just wanted to just briefly mention that.
Thank you, Sara. Well, this has been a wonderful discussion. I would like to extend our thanks to our guest speakers, Amanda, Koen and Myria. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the audience and finally extend our congratulations again to Sara. There were many messages celebrating your success in the question and answer. So thank you to everyone for coming, and we hope to see you at another event here soon.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.